Even if you're not a first-time homebuyer, closing day can be both exciting and scary. And really, most of the nervousness associated with closing day comes from the uncertainty or the unknown of what happens on or the few days leading up to closing. And that's exactly what I'm covering in today's video, so that you know exactly what to expect. You can limit those nerves and enjoy the process of closing on your next home purchase. So let's get moving. There are a few things you need to do to prepare for closing. Now, this is very, very important, just to realize later that you don't have access to the property. You want to buy your first home, but maybe you don't have 20% to put down or perfect credit. That's okay. If you're committed to a home purchase, then I'm here to help you do just that, maybe even sooner than you thought possible. My name is Scott Wynn, and I am a licensed mortgage advisor with the Wynn and Egan team at Citywide Home Loans. If you want to buy a home in the next 12 months, then click that subscribe button, and together we'll make it happen. Closing day on your home purchase is certainly a day to celebrate, but it's also a very serious day, considering you're going to be signing a lot of legal documents. But before I jump in and explain what you can expect and all the documents you'll be signing on closing day, we should talk about the few days leading up to closing. You might be wondering who sets the day and time for closing. Well, when you submitted your offer to the seller as part of the negotiation process, one of the dates you set on your contract is the closing day. So unless there were any amendments to the contract, your date of closing was set at the time that the seller accepted your offer. Now, as far as the time of your closing, that is coordinated between you and your agent, as well as the seller and their agent, and ultimately the title company who will be coordinating the closing. Generally, the time of closing is set about a week out from the day of actual closing. Now, once your closing date and time have been set, there are a few things you need to do to prepare for closing. One of the first things you need to do is prepare your funds for closing. Now, your lender is required by law to provide a closing disclosure, or a CD, within 3 days prior to closing. Now, that closing disclosure is going to show you how much money you need to bring to closing. Now, preparing those funds is going to be an important preparation for closing, because there are a few different rules and requirements associated with where the funds can come from and how you bring those funds to closing. Your lender may have some specific requirements in terms of where your funds for closing are going to be coming from, and that's because of the underwriting process. They may have verified your funds are in a particular account, and therefore one of your underwriting conditions is that your funds from closing comes from that account. Your lender will most likely be in communication about this, but it's worthwhile asking, especially as you approach closing and get your funds prepared for closing. The other thing is you don't want to be moving money around from one account to another, and again, that comes down to underwriting. If you move money from one account to another, it could potentially jeopardize your final loan approval and therefore delay closing. So before you move any money around, it'd be worthwhile checking with your lender to make sure that that's going to be okay. As far as bringing the money to closing, the actual closing table, most people will bring a cashier's check. Not cash, not a personal check, not a money order, but a true cashier's check. Now, this is very important, because if you come to closing anticipating that you can just write a personal check for the amount of money due at the time of closing, you may actually jeopardize your ability to close that day. Instead, you'll just want to make sure that you have a cashier's check, or that you've wired the funds to the title company prior to closing. If you do end up going down the path of getting a cashier's check, what you'll want to do is make that cashier's check payable to yourself. And here's why. Let's say something doesn't go as planned and closing gets delayed. Well, in that case, you're going to want to be able to get those funds back into your account as quickly and easily as possible. If you've made the cashier's check payable to yourself, you simply go back to the bank and deposit it back into your account. But if all does go well, like it does 99% of the time, you simply just endorse that check over to the title company at the time of closing for your funds to close. Each title company and situation may be a little bit different. So although that's the advice that we provide to our clients and that works most of the time, it's always best to check with the title company ahead of closing before getting your cashier's check to make sure that they'll take a cashier's check made payable to you. The other thing you might want to check on is the maximum amount of funds you can bring in the form of a cashier's check. Some title companies have limits on the amount you can bring, which means that if you do exceed any limits set by the title company, you may have to wire those funds prior to closing. If you do have to wire funds, or that's just your preference, you're going to want to make sure that you get the wiring instructions. Now, most of the time, your lender, your real estate agent, or the title company itself will provide those wiring instructions to you. Now, this is very, very important. And the reason for that is because you're going to be wiring tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to closing in some cases. You certainly do not want those funds going somewhere they don't belong. And unfortunately, wire fraud is a big deal these days. So please make sure that you get the wiring instructions directly from the title company or your lender so that you know exactly where those funds are going and how to request the wire from your bank for the time of closing. Also be aware that sometimes wires can take some time to transmit over to the title company. And in some cases, you may need to wire those funds prior to the day of closing to ensure that those funds are there and ready to go at the time that you close. And as long as you're planning ahead, now is a great time to verify that you have a valid, non-expired photo ID ready for closing. The title company is going to require this, and the reason for that is because they are going to be notarizing documents for you at the time of closing. The notary will require a valid, non-expired ID. Now, that could be a driver's license, maybe a state ID, or even a passport, but it just needs to make sure that it has not yet expired. All right, so you've got your closing disclosure, you've prepared your funds for closing, and you verified that your photo ID is valid and will not expire before the day of closing. So now what? Well, utilities. Utilities are something you want to make sure that you can get set up prior to closing. We're talking electricity, cable, internet, trash service. Any of those types of utilities are going to be important to get set up prior to closing. Maybe you noticed I didn't mention water, and there's a reason for that. In Colorado, water is a lienable item. That means that if the seller has any water bill that is overdue or past due, that could put a lien on your property. Well, the title company's job is to insure against any liens when the property transfers from the seller's name to your name. So what does the title company do? They handle the transfer of the water from the seller to you as the buyer. As far as the other utilities go, you're going to want to contact them and let them know when your closing date is set for and when you will take possession so that the utilities can be turned on effective that particular day. One thing I should mention at this point is that possession does not necessarily occur on the same day of closing. Just like you negotiated the closing date at the time that you submitted your offer to the seller, possession is also a negotiable item. In most cases, the possession date and the closing date are the same. However, there are some situations where the seller needs a couple of days in order to vacate the property and move into their new home. In other situations, there may be a rent-back agreement where the seller will actually rent the home from you for a period of time while they potentially purchase their next home or move out of state or whatever they may need that extra month or so to move out. Either way, it's just a good idea to confirm that your possession date is going to be the same date as your closing date. And the best person to ask would be your real estate agent, as they are the one that are involved in the real estate contract and setting those dates. You certainly don't want to have a moving truck scheduled to move in just to realize later that you don't have access to the property. So now it's the day of closing. But before you head over to closing, you're probably going to want to do one last walkthrough of the property. This is just a good time to make sure that the property is still in good shape, especially if it has been vacant for a while. You're going to want to verify that there's no damage that has been done to the property since you last saw the home. The other thing is that you may have negotiated some inspection related items. During your inspection, if something came up and the seller agreed to fix those items, now is a very good time to verify that those items have been completed. Assuming all is good to go, then all that is left is closing. Most of the time for homes purchased in Colorado, the closing occurs at the title company. When you get to closing, it's hard to know exactly what to expect, at least in terms of who to expect. Now, in pre-COVID days, it was not unusual to see basically everybody at the time of closing. Be you and your agent, the seller and their agent, possibly the lender, and also the title closer. Nowadays, due to social distancing standards, it could be just you and the title closer. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter who's at closing as long as all the appropriate documents get signed by the right people. And the good news is you don't have to worry about that. The title company will coordinate making sure that all of the appropriate parties sign all of the required documents in order to complete the closing transaction. So what will you be signing? Well, there's actually two transactions that are occurring at the same time. There's the real estate transaction, and then there is the mortgage transaction. Your home purchase transaction is generally going to have less documentation than, say, the mortgage transaction. The documents for the home purchase will generally include a settlement statement, a deed, tax transfer, property condition and value report for the county tax assessor, title insurance documents, and any affidavits such as alternative name and amendments to the contract that have not yet been signed. Your mortgage documents will include the closing disclosure, loan application, deed of trust, note, servicing disclosure, privacy disclosure, just to name a few. And maybe all those documents already sound overwhelming and a bit confusing. Well, don't worry. That's why the title closer is there. The title closer will step through each individual document, providing a brief explanation of what it is that you're signing. And if you need a minute or two to read through a particular disclosure, you'll be given that time to do so. But if you're the type of person that wants to thoroughly review and read every single document, closing time is not the time to do that, unless you want to spend 3 to 4 hours at closing doing just that. Instead, what I would recommend, if that's important to you, is that you contact the title company, your lender, or your real estate agent ahead of closing to see if you can get a copy of the closing package so you can review it thoroughly ahead of time. Generally, closing takes about an hour, but depends largely upon how many documents there are, how many questions you have, and how thoroughly you'd like to review each document at the time of closing. Once you're done signing, you're done. The house is yours and you're now a homeowner. Congratulations. Now, most of the time, you'll have access to the home immediately, unless, again, there was some sort of post-occupancy agreement or delay to taking possession of the home. And that means you will generally get keys and garage door openers right then and there. So there you have it. Now you know what happens on and the few days leading up to closing. But what questions do you have about closing? Leave it in the comments below and I will make sure to get back to you with an answer to your question as soon as possible. And once again, congratulations on your home purchase.